So I'm just beginning to sketch out the landscape. This is an old painting, a little canvas, well, it's actually a wood block that I painted and then just sanded it down, and I'm just going to paint over that. So a lot of my paintings I like to paint over paintings that didn't quite work out, because it gives a nice surface on which to paint. It just makes the paint seem richer. So I tend to reuse my old canvases or wood blocks or whatever I painted on before. So I'm just blocking in some green over there. I used cadmium yellow, and then it was a dark blue. I forget which one it was. It was it's a more like a dark turquoise blue to make the green, and it's just the base coat. I'm going to work into it with other colors as I go along. So that's just blocking things out at the moment. And those are the hills behind the middle ground. The middle ground is obviously that green. And I just mix some brown with some green and maybe a little bit of red and white. Just, again, it's the undercoat. I just put in a little more white over there just to lighten it up a little bit, so to bring that hill a little bit further forward than the one behind it. And then just touching up on that middle hill. Actually, the light one is the one behind, and the dark one is the one in front of it. So I just wanted to get a distinction between the two hills to get a sense of perspective. So now I just mixed a little bit of brown with, it was burnt umber, with a little bit of yellow ochre and white, and I'm just putting in the sand on the ground between the vines. So again, I just block in with a relatively correct color, and as you can see there, I just added some white, well, lighter color, just to get it more accurate. So the first coat you put on, the first layer, doesn't really have to be accurate at all. It's just giving you a sense of where things are, maybe obviously a little bit of the color it's going to be, and a sense of how light or how dark it is, just to sketch it in, just give you an idea of where you're going. So at the back I'm just adding white. I just had white on my brush, and then because the paint is wet, I can use the canvas or the wood block as the palette. So mixing it in with wet paint is obviously going to make it into a light brown, so I don't have to mix everything on the palette before I put it on the painting. So the sky, I was using that same darker turquoise blue with some white, just filling in the sky. And then at the bottom of the sky, just making it a little bit lighter. Tends to make the sky look like it's going further in the distance at the lower part of itself, so that it just feels like it's a canopy of sky over the landscape. So just adds to the sense of distance in the landscape. So now what I'm doing is I'm thinking about getting the green a little more accurate. So obviously the green was a little too bright and a little too dark, so I added some yellow ochre and some white to that, just to make it a little more golden looking. And then also I wanted to give it a sense of getting a little higher in the middle, so it's got a little hill to it, or a feeling of a very small hill, and so making the middle part lighter than the sides helps to suggest that. And then in the hill, I'm behind there, the brown hills, putting some light in again, just because there is a lot of light. It was quite a bright sunny day. Putting the light in the center of the hills, but leaving the edge a little bit darker, so that it stands out in a silhouette-like way against the sky. So the sky is lighter than the hills. So if I make the hills altogether lighter, they're not going to stand out in front of the sky. So that's what I did over there. So here I am doing the vines. I'm just using a dark paint. What I want to do is put the shadow color down first, rather than trying to put it in between the light parts. So I'm just my base color is the dark shadow. I'm using vertical lines, so just with sketching in that color, it makes it look like it's growing in a vertical way, so they're standing upright. So just with a little sketch like this, I can suggest that it's growing up. So my ground, the sand color, I used horizontal lines, which makes that look flat. So I'm getting a sense of the ground being flat and the vines growing up in a vertical manner away from the ground. So even with just a few marks, you can get a sense of how the landscape is structured there in the vines. And then also putting the vines a little bit over the sides of the sand, because from our perspective, the way we're looking at the picture, we're seeing the vines on top of the ground. So whatever you paint last, whatever you paint over something, in front of something, that's the one that will look like it's in front of something. So if you paint hills and then you paint the sky after it, a little bit like I've done over there, sometimes looks like it's in front of the hills rather than behind it. So with the vines, I wanted to make sure that the ground looked like it was behind. So I did that first and then painted the grounds on top of that. I mean the vines on top of that. So I'd added a little more dark shadow over there, and now I'm just adding some highlights. So this is just a general color. It's in anything, in fact. There is not just one light or one dark or one green or one this and that and the other. So I'm going to work into that with a couple of other greens, just mixing it together. But I'm getting a sense, so the dark is kind of popping out between the light, and the light is sitting on top of the dark. Physically, the paint is sitting on top of it, so it looks like the light part is the highest thing, which helps to also give that sense of three-dimensionality and verticalness of the vines. So I put that in. It's at this stage it's just a note for myself that there is light there, because as I put the dark green on, it kind of makes the light disappear, so I have to bring it back. So with any painting, there's always a putting in and taking off, putting in and taking off, and kind of adjusting things, moving things around until it eventually works. So, and that when you put things down, like I said, it's a note for yourself. It's just seeing how things are going to work and then working with that. So I've got 3 or 4 colors coming on now. I've got like a kind of a darker, warmer green, and then I've got that acid yellow green on top, and then the dark green underneath. So I'm just getting variety of greens. It's showing the different leaves that are there. The younger leaves are obviously lighter than the older leaves, and then also just the various shadows, the dark deep shadows and then the not so deep shadows in between the light, so you get a feeling of the all the variety that goes on within nature and sunlight. So yeah, it's starting to take a little bit of shape. And then what I'm doing now is I'm putting the lightest part closest to the viewer. So as the vines go further back, they get darker. So I want to make sure that I have that. But I also want to bring a little bit of the light back there so that it's not just suddenly stopping and becoming dark. It's actually, got a little bit of light in the background as well, but mostly in the front. So I'm just putting the shadows on the ground from the vines. I started off with brown, which was burnt umber, but it was a little too brown. So because sunlight is yellow, the shadows tend to look blue or blue-purple against that. It's just the play of light and shadow. And it's on the colour wheel. If you look on the colour wheel, kind of a blue-purple would be the opposite of a yellow-orange. So essentially the light part of the ground is a light yellowy, orangey, brown colour, and then the shadows they're kind of a blue-grey, and they're dark, so the dark against the light also helps that. If you mix brown and blue, it makes a nice warm grey, which works nicely because you've got a feeling of the blue, but it's not totally blue, it's got a grey feel, but the blue helps to work with the yellow in the way that I mentioned, the yellow against the blue. So I'm just blending those in a little bit to make them a little more shadowy looking, not so much like objects. So before, when they were a bit darker, they didn't quite look like shadows. Now they look a little more like shadows. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to just pick out a little bit more of the light on the vine. So again, so the shadows I just did, which means the paint of the shadows is actually a little bit on top of the vines. So the vines kind of feel like they're a bit behind the shadows. So I want to just correct that and make the vines feel like they're on top of the shadows again. So just picking out those light bits again. So the paint, the physical paint, it's like sculpting the paint that is closest to us, the highest protruding paint from the canvas is the one in the which gives the illusion that it's closest to us. So using thick paint, putting it on top of your other paint, making it lighter, it all works together to make it feel like it's the thing that's closest to us. So just again, I'm just bringing a little light towards the back of the vines, but not too much so that I don't ruin that feeling of it getting darker to the back. And then they're a little yellow, so I'm just putting some basic yellow in. The light color I used was basically cadmium yellow and a little bit of green, a little bit of white, and then I just put some pure cadmium yellow on top just to bring out a little bit of that sunlight yellow. So just working into the landscape a little bit, I want to, in the background, just want to make it look a little bit sketchy, so it looks like I'm just glancing at the background. So when you look at anything, the thing that you're looking at directly is the most in focus, and everything else is in your peripheral vision, which is going to be a little bit blurry. So if you know, with your focal point, so paintings traditionally have a focal point, and the focal point is, with my paintings, I tend to find that is the thing that I put the most detail in. It's the most in focus. It's, the thing that I'm most interested in. And then everything else is slightly sketchier, if not a lot sketchier than that. And it just frames the focal point, and it just keeps your eye on the focal point. It actually adds to the realism of the picture if you don't put everything in focus. So the background, I'm trying to keep less in focus than the foreground, just because, well, it's closer to us, the foreground, and it's the thing that we are looking at. The vines are kind of the point of this painting. So when I'm sketching the background in, I'm looking at the tones. I'm looking at what kind of yellow or what kind of brown it is. Is it a pink brown or a yellow brown, or is there any blue in the brown, that kind of thing. And then also the dark or lightness of it. So the hill that I'm actually doing right now is a little bit darker than the one behind it. So I want to make sure that I keep, even though there's light in it, which I was just putting in, that hill tends to be darker than the one behind it. So I want to make sure that I keep that happening. And then just little details of color, just like you're glancing across the landscape and you're just kind of seeing the color pop out here and there. Keeps it fresh. And this is just a sketch. It's not a finished painting. It's just a little quick sketch on how to construct a landscape. So again, I'm just bringing in some white into that brown. The brown is wet, and I'm just adding a little bit of white to lighten it up. So my palette is also the canvas. So I'm just mixing the paint on the canvas, on the wooden block. Okay, just adding a few shadows over there, just a few darks. Having good strong darks helps to finish off a picture, so not too many of them, but a little bit here and there. Also having some nice bright whites helps to finish off a picture too. So that's what I'm doing now.